Hi, this is Sheb Varghese. Welcome to the Faith Colloquium podcast. Today my guest is Bonnie Kristian. Bonnie is a graduate of Bethel Seminary and is the author of a new book, A Flexible Faith, Rethinking What It Means to Follow Jesus Today, which we'll be talking about. Thanks for joining me, Bonnie.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so I'm curious what got you to thinking you wanted to write this book?
Sure. So I sort of usually go back to two audiences that I had in mind as the motivating factor. One would be Christians, and I would place myself in this category, but people who have grown up in the church, maybe, in one sort of stream of Christianity, one sort of tradition, be that a single denomination or sort of just a general category, and really have never been very familiar with the rest of the Church Universal, which of course is quite broad. And so, for example, I grew up attending mostly Christian schools, and thinking back to my high school years, we had the full range of traditions represented within even my own class. We had I believe Catholics, certainly lots of Protestants. We even had a Greek Orthodox kid. And yet when I graduated from high school, I could not have told you beyond like some sort of facile predestination debates what was the difference between our different churches and how were they related, and how was this all one faith, what united us, but also in what ways were we divided, and how did those things relate to each other, and how did they matter. And I think that's really unfortunate, because we do have this very big tradition, and we do have the universal church, and there are many things to learn from, for our own faith, from these other branches of Christianity. And so that's the first audience, because I think when we lack that knowledge, when we lack that familiarity of what other Christians believe and why they believe it and how it relates to what we believe, it can tend to breed, a sort of suspicion or distrust of those other Christians. And, we wonder, are they as Christian as we are? Should we work with them on service projects? Is there a point where someone's beliefs are so different that, we can't maybe serve the community together because they're too strange of too different of a type of Christian? So the second audience would be people who, whether they're new to Christianity or not, they can't with intellectual or spiritual integrity stay with the type of Christianity that's most familiar to them. So people who are in a season of doubt or questioning or deconstruction, maybe you grow up, say, Baptist, and you have gotten to a point where you say, I just don't think I can be a Baptist anymore. And so then the question becomes, well, does that mean you have to leave the faith entirely? And I think the answer is no. And I think that finding out more about, what else is out there, what other ways are there to be a Christian and to faithfully follow Jesus, and be really life-saving and be a lifeline in those moments. And so that audience was the second motivation that I had for writing A Flexible Faith.
So Christians who've grown up in one specific tradition but haven't really talked to other traditions, so might be suspicious of these other traditions. You want to expose them to say, like, yeah, we can actually call these people our brothers and sisters. And also for these Christians who feel uncomfortable within their own tradition and worry that might mean leaving Christianity altogether. It almost sounds like it's like a apologetic kind of work in that sense.
Yeah, I haven't necessarily used that word, but it is in a sense, for that readership to say, there are these other options, and it's a good thing to explore them. Yeah,
that's great. I remember talking with a friend of mine recently who would fit more into that second group of people you were talking about, grew up in one specific tradition and recently has begun to have doubts about Christianity. And he was talking to me and said, like, man, I don't know if I believe in a literal creation story anymore. And that was like really racking his faith,
Mm.
And I just kind of chuckled and I said, that's okay. That's that's okay. Like, that doesn't mean you don't have to be a Christian. Yeah. So you go through all these different, I guess I might say, like, controversial theological topics in your book. I'm curious how you decided to choose these ones opposed to different ones.
Yeah. So it was a combination of things. Some of it was, for example, Greg Boyd, who wrote the foreword, he and Paul Eddy authored this book called Across the Spectrum some years back, which has some format similarities to A Flexible Faith for sure. And so looking at their book and similar books, Zondervan, for example, puts out a series called, I believe, Counterpoints, where they sort of do at book length for a single issue what I do at chapter length. So some of it, a lot of it was looking and seeing like, what have other people, what is sort of the general consensus of like the questions that people are asking and the debates that need to be explained. And then I would say some of it where my book tends to differ from those previous works is that there's a greater attention to what, for lack of a better word, I've called like lifestyle issues. So questions about like, should Christians vote? Can Christians be wealthy? Even getting into, well, I don't know if this is as excluded from these sort of series as it used to be, but questions of gay marriage, those sorts of things that are very much impactful of like your day-to-day life. Those were an addition that I made significantly just from sort of personal observation of like what are the questions that are being raised for people in my observation and acquaintanceship that need to be included but are not necessarily as well addressed in sort of the more book works that are more focused on traditional theological debates, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So you've got this format where you take a topic like can Christians vote or like baptism, and you kind of lay out different positions on it. And then in some chapters you say like, okay, and now here's my view. And in other chapters you kind of offer like a historical person. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the historical figure is actually in every chapter.
Okay.
And that was super important, I thought, because Protestants especially, we are just not great at church history.
Yeah.
We have like, the first 100 years, and then there's a gap until the Reformation.
Right.
And then you find out sort of the big names, and then in America, at least it seems, there's a gap until like the Great Awakening. Maybe you get some Jonathan Edwards, and then it's today. And that's a problem because like there's, these people who have lived for, in these hundreds of years before us, they've thought through the same thing, a lot of the same things that we're thinking through. They've confronted these problems, and we're depriving ourselves of like so many resources by that ignorance. And so I wanted to introduce people to some of the key figures of church history that may not be otherwise familiar. As far as including my own perspective, my goal there, and it's in about a third of the chapters, my goal there was just in places where, this is something that if it's a topic that it's been important to my own faith, like working through that. It's a topic where I have a particularly strong opinion. I thought that was important to share, both to sort of alert readers of where I would be more likely to be biased against the views that I don't hold. And also because, I think there's some value in modeling sort of that wrestling with the issue and coming to a conclusion that I think in most, if not all of the cases where I shared my perspective was not identical to the perspective with which I was raised on the subject.
Yeah. Yeah. So you break down helpfully this way of thinking about Christian doctrines, like, okay, like this is really important to our Christian faith. This is not as important. Can you kind of explain what those terms are and what they mean?
Sure. And so that model, as I mentioned in the introduction, is not original to me. I heard it from Greg Boyd, and I don't actually know if it's original to him either. But the idea is thinking of consensus circles and using that visual to sort of understand that not all beliefs and practices are of equal importance to our faith or are not as core in terms of defining what is a Christian, especially in opposition to the question of what is a heretic. And so at the core of the circles would be the person of Jesus Christ. And that's not our ideas about Jesus, but like the actual person, God in the flesh. And that Jesus, of course, is the center of our faith. And so then the next circle, like just sort of surrounding that core, is what we could call dogma. And these are like very, very basic definitional beliefs about God, about humanity. I used, for example, the Apostles' Creed as a really good summary of dogma. It's very brief. It's something that, certainly some traditions are non-creedal, so they don't want to like sign on to the creed. But in terms of the content, pretty much everyone in historic Orthodox Christianity can say like, yes, I agree with the content of this creed. And so what I'm discussing in A Flexible Faith, where there's these debates and where I'm saying, there's multiple options on this within Orthodoxy, it's not dogma issues. the dogma issues are kind of not really up for debate if you want to avail yourself of the label of historic Christianity, because the dogma issues are really like the definition. If someone says, what is Christianity? Give me a quick explanation. That's sort of the stuff that you would say. So then the next circle, and this is, I think, the bulk of what I'm talking about in this book, is what we can call doctrine. And doctrine issues are sort of the level where we're seeing splits between denominations. Like a doctrine level question is what separates, say, a Lutheran and a Catholic. And doctrines tend to elaborate on and explain and flesh out what we find in the dogma category. So the dogma category might say something like, we believe this happens, and then doctrine would come along and say, and here's how it happens, and here's how that works, and how it affects other things. And then the final largest circle on the outside is what we could call opinions. And that's the sort of thing that can coexist within a single denomination, even within a single congregation. Some of the stuff that I talk about in the book would be opinion, probably. And there's always going to be, some debate about exactly what should go in what circle. But I think overall, the model helps us sort of keep things in perspective, understand what is at stake in any given theological conversation or disagreement, and to refrain from trying to pick people out of the church, label them as heretics when they're disagreeing with us over something that is really properly labeled like a doctrinal or opinion disagreement and doesn't get at those core issues, no matter how passionately we may personally feel about that question.
Yeah, that's helpful. What would you say to, let's say you're talking to a Catholic, right? Mm-hmm. And a Catholic says you're placing this in the doctrine category, but actually this is a dogma issue. So you can have these debates about these different theological issues, but then there's the debate about, well, what is dogma and what is doctrine, right? And that seems to be another conversation that I think you kind of talked about with how we talk about gay marriage. Mm-hmm. But that's another kind of debate about, well, which of these things does this land into?
Right.
So how would you respond to someone who said okay, what you've placed in doctrine actually belongs in dogma? Yeah.
Yeah, that's tricky. And this is part of why I went to the Apostles' Creed for that definition, because it is so ancient and so widely accepted. And so it's not just sort of my arbitrary category of me saying, well, I think this is dogma. It has that weight of wide acceptance over the course of church history to say, this is a good, succinct summary of the basics of our faith. That said, that's not going to settle it for plenty of people, and I get that. And this is a debate, I think that it's difficult, especially because I would say that, we think of the term fundamentalism, and if I can use that divorced from sort of the, early 1900s specific context of theology in which it was created, and use it the way it's used now, where it's sort of a negative term suggesting a certain narrow-mindedness and a certain refusal to consider other options. Fundamentalism, in a sense, is where you want to herd everything into the dogma category and deny that anything is of lesser import and anything can be considered doctrine and opinion. And so that's difficult, I think, when there's that predilection to make everything of high importance, because it does make healthy and productive disagreement and discussion very, very difficult. It makes everything very high stakes, and questioning one thing becomes questioning everything. So I don't know that I have a great, succinct answer to what would I say if someone says, I think this issue you've labeled doctrinal is actually at the dogma level, except to say, let's look at sort of the sweep of church history, and have most people agreed with you on that? Have most people over the course of our faith said this is so core to what it means to be a Christian? Yeah, in that sense, I think looking at some of the historic creeds that are accepted across Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox divisions can help.
Yeah, that's good. And I just want to point out that the title of your book is A Flexible Faith, right? But lest someone thinks that you're advocating for some kind of wishy-washy Christianity that's all about relativism or something like that. You're really clear in the book that you're not trying to promote that. You say, this isn't to say that theological differences don't matter, that any or all options of faith are equally correct, but you say that we don't live in a perfect world. Yeah, so could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so I raise, these, what is it, like 17 questions or something in the book, theological questions. And for each of those, I believe there is like a true answer. Hopefully, it's one of the answers that, the church has historically taught and not just something else entirely. And we've totally missed the boat, right? But for each of them, I think there is a right answer. And so, a lot of these answers are not right. They're wrong. And so I'm not, suggesting that they're all, somehow equally true at once, or that the distinction doesn't matter. In many cases, I think that there's huge implications for which answer you pick is going to have huge implications for how we understand God and the universe and what God wants from humanity and all these sorts of things. So I do think there is a right answer. I do think there is a truth in each of these cases. However, and I hope, that my own beliefs are correct, that I've got that right answer. However, I also, think that we have to have the humility to recognize have been billions of Christians, many of them very faithful, very devout, very, sincerely pursuing Christ and life in Christ, who have disagreed with me. And so as much as I'm going to do my best to seek the truth and to seek the correct answer on all of these theological questions, I know that there's a chance that I'm not getting it right, and that this disagreement is legitimate, and that it's not a sign of a lack of faithfulness. And so I think that there's a certain humility required to say, I think I'm right. I recognize I could be wrong. And I recognize that you disagreeing with me on this, as much as I, prefer you didn't disagree, doesn't mean that you're not a Christian, or that you're, careless about your theology or careless about following Christ.
Yeah. I'm curious, maybe this would be the last question I ask you. So something I'm kind of always thinking about is the fragmentation of the church, and how the church can work towards unity. Mm-hmm. And you, on the back cover of your book, you talk about how the fact that we have a flexible faith is this wonderful thing, that there's this broad spectrum, that we have this theological diversity. But then you also talk about this is also a result of not being in a perfect world, mm-hmm. right? In a perfect world, we would all worship Christ in one way. And I was recently listening to a conversation with Kevin Van Hooser and Peter Leithart, and Kevin Van Hooser was talking about, if I could like press a button and make all Lutherans Presbyterians, I don't know that I would want to. And he was talking about, the beauty of having this harmony in the Christian tradition, and what's lost when you kind of make everything this one voice. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that when it comes to church unity.
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple distinctions to be made. So one is that in terms of our present situation, on the one hand, obviously, having written this book, I do think there are advantages in recognizing this diversity and recognizing that we can learn from it. And, especially for the people who, like your friend who you described, are going through like this season of doubt or questioning, if you can introduce them to these other traditions, and that's, I think, a wonderful thing in practice. On the other hand, I do think there's a sense in which the division, and especially insofar as it involves animosity, the division within the church and the way that we've had so many splits and schisms is a really sad thing and a tragedy, and a reflection of our failure to maintain and pursue unity in Christ. As far as like sort of our eventual unity, in the end of all things, I think that means, when I say that, eventually we'll all worship Christ together, I think that means that we'll have unity on the theological questions, right? Like in terms of the questions that I'm addressing in this book, we will know in full. Now we know in part. Then we will know, like, what is the right answer to these questions? Like, what right. is the best way to talk about atonement? How does God prefer us to do baptism? Right. And so we'll have agreement on those things. Right. But I don't think, of course, that it means unity in the sense of erasing sort of the cultural and personal diversity in terms of like our different ways of worshiping God, and our different giftings and different things that we bring to the church. I don't think that will go away. And I don't think, God or we would want it to go away. I think there will be a greater unity on sort of these questions of truth, but not a unity in a more negative sense of erasing our differences that contribute to our worship.
Yeah, so the book is called A Flexible Faith, and it's very, very accessible, easy reading. And I think you do a great job of laying out the different options clearly and without showing your bias. So yeah, I especially thought, and I don't know if you intended this as an audience as well, but like for non-Christians as well, like to get a sense of like, okay, like Christians aren't monolithic in what they believe either. I thought it'd be great for them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's maybe sort of a third thing that I don't talk about quite as much, but I did certainly write it with people who are not Christians or even are very new to the church, who don't have familiarity with all the, complex lingo and terms that we use often without thinking, that makes sort of conversations about faith very inaccessible because they're just unfamiliar.
Yeah. Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe and please share with your friends.